They called it Kethsora, the unmasking. It happened when pressure was applied, when resources ran dry, when the stars themselves seemed to tighten like a fist around a world and forced it to reveal what lived beneath its diplomacy, beneath its treaties, beneath its carefully worded transmission signals that said we are peaceful, we are reasonable, we are like you. The Dominion had seen Kethsora happen to 43 civilizations. 43 worlds had crumbled, surrendered, or burned. Fleet Commander Vel stood at the observation window of the Dominion throne, the flagship that had ended 17 wars before the first shot was ever fired, simply by appearing in orbit. It was 3 kilometers of black alloy and gravitational weaponry, and it hummed with a frequency that smaller species described, in their dying transmissions, as the sound of being forgotten. Vel was Velthari, which meant he was tall, cold-blooded in the literal sense, and possessed of a secondary nervous system that processed threat data faster than most species processed color. His skin was the pale gray of a dead moon. His 4 eyes moved independently, always scanning, never resting. His species had not known fear in 11 generations. They had engineered it out of their biology the same way they had engineered out mercy. They were, by every measurable metric, the most dangerous military civilization in the known cluster. And they had just sent Earth a requisition of submission. It was not a declaration of war. The Dominion didn't declare wars. They sent requisitions, formal documents outlining what they required from a civilization in exchange for continued existence. Planets, resources, population labor, the right to strip mine 2 moons and redirect a gas giant's hydrogen output for 300 years. Earth's response was expected within 72 hours. Most civilizations responded within 6. Earth took 68 hours and 41 minutes. Then they sent a single transmission. Not a counteroffer. Not a plea. Not the usual desperate scrambling for middle ground that Vel had seen so many times it had become tedious. Just a list of names. 11 names. And a note that read, "We don't negotiate with requisitions, but we do respond to them. These 11 individuals are being dispatched to your flagship immediately. They are not diplomats. They are not soldiers. We strongly suggest you read the attached psychological profiles before they board. Earth Coordination Office, Sector 7. Vel stared at the message for a long time. His secondary nervous system, the one that processed threat data, fired 3 times in rapid succession, an involuntary response he hadn't experienced since he was a child standing too close to a plasma reactor. He told himself it was a malfunction. He opened the psychological profiles anyway. The first one was a woman named Carla Voss. The file opened with a standard header. Age, 39. Height, average. Weight, average. Homeworld, Earth, North American region. Then the clinical notes began. Vel read for 11 minutes. Without blinking. When he finished, he closed the file. Opened the second profile. A man named Dennis Hauer. Read it. Closed it. Opened the third. A woman named Simone Park. Closed it. He called his senior strategist, a Velthari named Keln, who entered the command chamber and stood in the precise posture of readiness that 11 years of military training had carved into his body. "Sir? Cancel the standard boarding protocol," Vel said quietly. "Sir, the shuttle is already en route." "I know." He turned from the window. All 4 of his eyes settled on Keln in a way that the strategist had only seen once before, during the collapse of Miran 9, when 40,000 Velthari soldiers had walked into what they thought was a surrender ceremony and discovered it was something else entirely. "Prepare the secondary containment deck," Vel said, "and seal the crew quarters on levels 4 through 7. That's a significant precaution for 11 humans, sir." Vel looked back at the profiles on his screen. "Read the files, Keln," he said softly. "Read all 11. Then tell me if you think it's enough." They arrived on a shuttle that looked like it had been repaired with materials from at least 4 different spacecraft, none of them human. The docking team noted this, with professional detachment. The hull patches were Krellian. The thruster housing was Dominion standard, salvaged. The navigation array was Fethic, which meant it had been stripped from a civilization the Dominion had absorbed 40 years ago and shouldn't exist in functional form anymore. The shuttle landed crooked. Not catastrophically. Just slightly. Like whoever had piloted it had decided that exactly level was a suggestion rather than a requirement. The docking bay doors opened. The first one out was Carla Voss. She was not what the Velthari expected. They had studied human physiology extensively. Bipedal. Fragile skeleton. Single nervous system. Emotionally unstable, driven by chemical signals that produced what humans called feelings, a concept the Dominion found tactically exploitable and intellectually baffling in equal measure. Carla Voss was 5'6" and had the kind of stillness about her that didn't match her surroundings. She looked around the docking bay, 300 meters of polished Dominion alloy, armed guards in every corner, gravitational weapons charged and visible, and her expression didn't change. Not because she was brave, because she was cataloging. Her eyes moved the way a spider's legs moved. Systematically. Quietly. She was not looking at the guards. She was looking at the power conduits running along the ceiling. The positioning of the gravitational emitters. The 3 emergency blast doors, and their locking mechanisms. She had been in the bay for approximately 9 seconds. Behind her came Dennis Hauer, who was eating something, a dense, dark food object he'd apparently brought from the shuttle, and who nodded at the nearest armed guard the way you'd nod at someone you recognized from a neighborhood you used to live in. Then came Simone Park, who was carrying a bag that the scanning systems flagged, then flagged again, then produced an alert that read contents unclassifiable in 3 different Dominion languages, which had never happened before. Then the other 8. Surithkeln, watching from the upper observation deck, felt something he was fairly certain wasn't supposed to be possible for a Velthari. He felt uncertain. Not afraid. The Velthari didn't do afraid. But uncertain. That slightly nauseating sensation of having prepared thoroughly for something and realizing the preparation had addressed the wrong question entirely. Osrith Vel stood beside him. The profiles, Surithkeln said quietly. I read them. All 11? All 11. A pause. The Earth Coordination Office. Do they know what they sent us? That, said Osrith Vel, watching Carla Voss finish her sweep of the docking bay and begin, without permission, without being led, walking toward the corridor that led deeper into the ship, is what I am trying to determine. Below them, a Velthari guard stepped forward and said, in the universal trade language, You will wait for escort. Carla Voss stopped, turned, looked at the guard. I know, she said. I just wanted to see if you'd stop me. She walked back to the group and stood calmly. The guard's secondary threat processing system fired twice. The Dominion had a classification system for dangerous entities. Class 1, conventional military threat. Weapons. Training. Tactical capability. Class 2, unconventional military threat. Biological, chemical, psychological warfare capability. Class 3, systemic threat. Entities capable of disrupting infrastructure, communication networks, supply chains. Class 4. Existential. Reserved for entities the Dominion had only theorized about, something that could threaten the Dominion not through force but through existence. Through the simple fact of being present and thinking. No civilization had ever produced a Class 4 designation. The 11 humans didn't fit any of the existing classes. Surithkeln had spent the 3 hours before the shuttle docked building a new classification framework. He was meticulous. He was trained by the finest strategic minds in the Dominion. He had classified threats across 9 star systems. He ended up with a document that was 400 lines long and concluded, in his most careful professional language, with the following sentence. Recommend reclassification of threat paradigm. Current framework insufficient. These individuals do not threaten through capability. They threaten through orientation. Orientation. It was the best word he had. Carla Voss had spent 14 years in a human institution for individuals who process social reality in ways that the broader human population found incompatible with shared living. She had not been there because she was violent. She had been there because she was too accurate. She read systems, bureaucracies, power structures, social hierarchies, the way other people read text, and she had a compulsive need to describe what she saw aloud, which had caused significant distress to everyone around her over the course of her life. She had also, during her 14 years in that institution, taught herself 4 languages, completed 2 advanced degrees using correspondence materials, and quietly reorganized the institution's internal supply allocation system without telling anyone, resulting in a 34% efficiency improvement that administration had spent 3 years trying to explain. She described this as just something to do. Dennis Hauer had never been institutionalized. He had worked as an infrastructure engineer for the first part of his adult life. Then, he had stopped. Not because he was fired, not because of failure. He had simply, in his own words, gotten bored with things that worked. He now spent his time finding broken systems, mechanical, social, organizational, and solving them. Not for money. Not for recognition. Reportedly, just for the particular satisfaction of the moment when something that was wrong became right. He had been found by the Earth Coordination Office doing unauthorized repairs on a Krellian deep space relay station. Alone. With tools he had fabricated himself. The Krellians had been trying to repair that station for 11 years. Hauer had fixed it in 4 days and left before anyone arrived. Simone Park's file was the one that had given Osrathvel the longest pause. She had no dramatic institutional history. No single defining incident. Her file simply documented, over the course of 37 years, a consistent pattern of being present when things changed. She had been in 6 different conflict zones as a civilian logistics worker. In all 6, the conflict had ended, not through military resolution, not through political negotiation, but through a kind of unraveling that the involved parties could never adequately explain afterward. Supply lines had shifted. Key individuals had changed positions. Alliances had quietly reformed around new priorities. Simone Park's name appeared in no official reports. She held no titles. She gave no orders. She was simply always there, and things changed. The Dominion had a word for this, too. Velketh. The current beneath the current. The cause that doesn't appear in the record. They had never assigned it to an individual before. Only to rivers. The Dominion had a protocol for visiting delegations. Formal meeting room. Translated communication interface. Structured agenda. Power displayed openly. The right art on the walls. The right weapons visible. The right officers present. To communicate unmistakably that the Dominion was the larger gravity well in this interaction, and that everything, including generosity, flowed downhill toward the visitors. Osrathvel had used this protocol 46 times. He abandoned it for the 11 humans. Not because he was afraid. He told himself this carefully. He abandoned it because the protocol was designed to establish psychological leverage, and you could not establish leverage on a system that wasn't measuring the same variables you were using to measure it. Instead, he had a meal prepared. Dominion food, nothing adapted for human biology. He wanted to see how they responded to being presented with something unfamiliar and not designed for them. They were seated in the secondary meeting room, which was smaller and had no obvious weapons display, though every surface was monitored, and the ceiling contained 3 concealed restraint field emitters. Karlavas sat down, looked at the food, and said, "The emitters are in the ceiling. Triangular arrangement, about 2 meters apart. Range is probably 8 feet. You'd need everyone seated to cover the whole room." The room went quiet. Osrathvel, seated across from her, studied her face. "How did you?" "The floor sensors shift weight distribution data to a central point," she said, pointing at a nearly invisible seam in the flooring. "It's a different alloy. Slightly different resonance when you walk over it. The ceiling panels above our seats have micro-perforations that don't match the ventilation pattern. And your officer near the door keeps glancing up at the same 3 points." She picked up a piece of Dominion food, examined it, and put it in her mouth. Chewed. "It's fine. A bit mineral. Like eating a river." Osrathvel looked at the officer near the door. The officer looked at the floor. Dennis Hauer was already disassembling the communication interface at his place setting, not aggressively, just the way someone picks up a new object to understand how it fits together. He'd removed 4 components before anyone noticed. "Sorry," he said, not looking up. "Your translation buffer is compressing mid-frequency vocal ranges. I'm assuming that's why your speech sounds like it has a slight echo to Dominion ears? Or is that intentional?" Surathkeln, standing against the wall, said quietly to no one in particular, "He's right. We've had a service ticket open on that for. Don't, Osrithvel said. Simone Park ate her food quietly and looked around the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't do anything overtly notable. But Osrithvel noticed that every time one of his officers shifted position, or exchanged a glance with another officer, or adjusted their posture, Simone Park's eyes moved, briefly, precisely, to the person who had reacted, not the person who had acted. She was reading the room by reading the responses. She was 2 steps downstream from everything, and she was building a complete map. After the meal, which the humans ate entirely and apparently enjoyed, though Dennis had given detailed structural feedback on 2 of the dishes as if they were engineering prototypes, Osrithvel asked the question he had been preparing since the shuttle docked. Why did Earth send you? Carla Voss looked at him with an expression he couldn't classify. Not defiance, not warmth. Something in between, something that felt almost like a kind of professional recognition, the look one very good surgeon gives another. Kero, she said, using the word that Earth's file had apparently described as a human expression of intention that had no direct translation, of mjhy. From this point on, I'll speak plainly, because I don't think the diplomatic register is useful to either of us. Osrithvel's 4 eyes stilled. She had used the correct pronunciation. You sent us a requisition, Carla continued. A Dominion requisition is a pressure test. You apply it to a civilization and you watch how the civilization responds, because the response tells you whether you're dealing with something that will bend, break, or surprise you. You've done this 43 times. 46, Osrithvel said quietly.
Right.
46. And in 46 cases, you got either surrender or war. Because that's what organized civilizations do. They either calculate that they can't win and submit, or they calculate that they can and fight. She set down her cup. But Earth didn't send its military. Earth didn't send its diplomats. Earth looked at your requisition, and the people at the coordination office, who are, I should mention, not entirely unlike us, looked at it and said, this is a system. What do you send to understand a system you've never encountered before? And the answer, Osrithvel said, was you. The answer, Carla said, was people who have spent their entire lives doing exactly one thing.
She paused.
Figuring out how things actually work. Not how they're supposed to work. Not how they appear to work. How they actually work. She leaned forward slightly. We're not here to fight you. We're not here to surrender to you. We're here because Earth looked at the Dominion and said, Kero, mjhy, from here on, I want to understand what you are before I decide what to do about you. The room was very quiet. Osrithvel felt his secondary nervous system fire again. This time, he was fairly certain it wasn't a malfunction. By the 3rd day, the Dominion throne had a problem. Not a crisis.
Not yet.
A problem, the kind that starts small and specific and then, if you look at it from the right angle, turns out to be structural. It started with Dennis Hauer. The man appeared to be incapable of walking through a space without understanding it. He had been assigned quarters on level 6 and given access to the common areas of levels 5 through 8, a generous allowance by Dominion standards, which normally restricted visiting delegations to a single room. This had been a mistake. Not because Hauer was hostile. He was, if anything, the most immediately pleasant of the 11. He greeted every Velthari crew member he encountered with the same nod, the neighborhood nod, as the crew had started calling it, and he had no apparent ego about rank, title, or the fact that he was a single human on a ship of 4,000. The problem was that he fixed things. He couldn't seem to help it. On the first day, he had corrected the translation buffer issue he'd identified at dinner, not by accessing any official system, but by rerouting a signal path through a tertiary communication node that the Dominion Throne's own engineering team had flagged as deprecated and stopped using. The fix worked. The echo in Dominion speech transmissions had been a minor persistent irritation for 11 months, listed in the maintenance queue under low priority, investigate when time permits. It had existed for 11 months. It took Hauer 40 minutes. On the second day, he had been walking past the level 6 atmospheric processing unit and stopped. Just stopped. Stood in front of the panel for 7 minutes. Then he'd opened the panel, looked at the interior, closed it, and walked away. 4 hours later, The atmospheric processing unit increased its efficiency by 12%. Nobody had touched it. Nobody could explain how. When Surith Keln reviewed the monitoring footage and asked Hauer what he'd done, Hauer had looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I just looked at it until I understood what it thought it was doing and what it should have been doing." Sometimes that's enough. The system corrects itself if someone just bothers to understand it properly. Surith Keln wrote this down verbatim and sent it to Osrithvel with the subject line, "I don't know what to do with this information." Meanwhile, Simone Park had said very little to anyone. She sat in the common areas and observed. She ate her meals. She slept apparently normal human hours. She was, by every behavioral metric, the least active of the 11. Osrithvel noticed that his officers were starting to say things differently around her. Not because she told them to, not because she asked questions, but in her presence, quiet, undemanding, simply there. The Velthari officers had started to self-correct their communication in ways that were subtle and interesting. They reported more accurately. They hedged less. A junior communications officer who had a persistent habit of overstating threat assessments to sound more indispensable had spent 20 minutes sitting near Simone Park on the second day and had, without any apparent trigger, submitted his first precisely accurate threat assessment in 8 months. When Osrithvel asked this officer why the change, the officer looked genuinely confused. It seemed more useful to be accurate," he said. On the third morning, Karla Voss asked to speak with Osrithvel privately. He agreed. He told himself he was curious. He was curious. He was also, if he was being precise, something else, a sensation that his biology shouldn't have been producing, a low-frequency alertness that wasn't threat response, and wasn't comfort. He realized, after they had been talking for several minutes, that it was the feeling of being understood, not evaluated, not assessed as a military obstacle or a political problem. Understood. It was profoundly unfamiliar. "You engineered fear out of your species," Karla said. "It wasn't a question. Your secondary nervous system replaced it. You made something faster and colder, and more functional." She was looking at him with that precise, cataloging gaze. "But there's a cost to that, isn't there? Because the same neurological pathways that process fear also process something else. I think in your language it might be closest to Velsunneth. Velsunneth. Longing. The ache toward what is absent." Osrithvel was quiet for a long moment. "How do you know that word?" he said. "Kero," she said. "I read everything I could find about Velthari culture in the 68 hours between when Earth received your requisition and when we launched. And of mjhy. I want to say something that might offend you, but I think you're capable of hearing it." "Say it." "The Dominion isn't conquering anymore because you want resources," Karla said. "You have resources. You've had resources for a century. You're conquering because you removed the capacity for longing from your biology, and the place where longing used to live is now a hole that empire fills. You expand because expansion feels, to your secondary nervous system, like the closest available substitute for wanting something." The silence was very long. "That," Osrithvel finally said, "is an extraordinary claim." "I know," Karla said. "Is it wrong?" On the fourth day, everything changed. Osrithvel had sent a communication to the Dominion High Command on the first day, standard protocol, a report on the arrival of the human delegation, and an assessment of the situation. He had described the humans as unconventional and suggested that the standard 72-hour response timeline for the requisition be extended. High Command had extended it by 48 hours. Then, apparently dissatisfied with Osrithvel's tone, which they had described as insufficiently decisive, they had dispatched someone. High General Vasthran. If Osrithvel was the Dominion's finest strategist, Vasthran was its finest weapon. He was old by Velthari standards, which meant he had been present at more unmasking events than anyone alive. He had personally overseen the requisition and subsequent absorption of 11 civilizations. He had a reputation, even within the Dominion, for a quality his subordinates described carefully as thoroughness. He arrived on a secondary shuttle, unannounced, at 0400 ship time. He came directly to the secondary meeting room, where Karla Voss was sitting. Apparently she slept very little, reading a Dominion technical manual that she had gotten from somewhere and had no business having. Vasthun looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down across from her, without speaking. This was, Osrithvel would later learn, the general's standard opening. Silence as pressure. He had sat silently across from the leaders of 3 civilizations until they had broken and begun offering concessions simply to fill the quiet. Carla Voss read her technical manual for 4 more minutes. Then she set it down and said, "You're much older than your file suggests. Or you've had significant restorative work done. The mobility pattern is what gives it away. You favor your left axis very slightly, which is a compensation response, not a natural gait. Something happened to your right side at some point, and it healed wrong, and the restorative work corrected the appearance but not the habit." She looked at him calmly. "I'm Carla. You're Vasthun. You've been sent here because someone in high command thinks Osrithvel is going soft. He's not. He's just smarter than whoever sent you." Vastruan's 4 eyes moved in the pattern that, in Velthari physiology, indicated a threat response engaging. "You," he said, "are a remarkable creature." "I've heard that before," Carla said. "Usually right before someone tries to remove me from a situation they don't understand. It doesn't tend to go well for them." Vastruan leaned forward. He was not a being that leaned. He was built for height and stillness and the authority of physical presence. When he leaned, it was a signal, controlled, deliberate, that he was shifting modes. "Earth sent 11 individuals to respond to a Dominion requisition," he said. "This is not a response. This is an insult. I have been sent to deliver a final ultimatum. Either Earth provides a formal military or governmental representative with authority to negotiate, or the requisition proceeds to its enforcement phase." "Kero," Carla said. "Ab mjhy. I'll be very direct. What you're describing as an enforcement phase is the destruction of infrastructure targets on Earth and 3 of its colony stations until a government representative appears. I know the Dominion's enforcement protocols. I read them on the way here. Then you understand the stakes." "I understand the script," Carla said. "I understand what you're supposed to do. I'm asking you to think about what will actually happen if you do it." She folded her hands on the table. "You will destroy infrastructure. Earth will not immediately produce a representative. Not because Earth is being defiant, although it is, but because the Earth Coordination Office has already calculated that the enforcement phase is survivable, and that surviving it without surrendering significantly weakens the requisition as a mechanism." She paused. "We've given this to our systems analysts. The probability of the Dominion achieving a satisfactory requisition outcome with Earth using standard enforcement protocols is somewhere around 11%. Vastruan said nothing. "Those aren't good odds for the civilization that's supposed to be undefeatable," Carla continued. "And more importantly, those aren't useful odds for the Dominion strategically, because a failed requisition becomes a very public data point for every civilization currently watching the standoff. Which is all of them. They're all watching." Something shifted in Vastruan's expression. Just slightly. Just enough.
Carla saw it. Of course she saw it.
"You already knew the odds weren't good," she said quietly. "That's not new information. What's new is that I know that you know, and now we're both sitting here with that fact between us." She tilted her head. "So, what do you actually want to happen here, General? Not the Dominion. Not High Command.
You.
What outcome, when you imagine it, gives you something that feels like satisfaction rather than just completion?" The question hung in the recycled air of the secondary meeting room. Vastruan had not been asked that question, in that form, by anyone in 60 years. Osrithvel couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for him. Velthari required less sleep than most species, 4 hours of unconsciousness in a 28-hour cycle, but Osrithvel often spent his non-sleep hours in the observation deck, watching the stars and running command scenarios in his mind with the automatic, slightly compulsive efficiency of a machine that couldn't turn itself off. Tonight, Dennis Hauer was already there. He was sitting on the floor, not in a chair, on the actual floor, with his back against the transparent barrier and a small collection of objects around him that Osrithvel couldn't immediately identify. Some appeared to be from the ship. Some appeared to be from the shuttle. Osrithvel sat down in a chair and said nothing. After a while, Hauer said, "This ship is incredible." It wasn't flattery. It was a statement of genuine technical appreciation, the kind of thing Osrithvel had heard engineers say about the Dominion throne since its commissioning, but never with this particular quality, which was more like the appreciation you'd have for a living thing than for a machine. "You've spent 3 days finding its flaws," Osrithvel said. "Same thing," Howard said. "A system's flaws are the most interesting parts. They tell you what the system is actually trying to do, not what it was designed to do. Sometimes those are the same. Usually they're not." He picked up one of the objects, turned it over. "Your propulsion architecture is making a choice. Efficiency. Everything is sacrificed for maximum output at maximum speed. And it works. The throne is the fastest thing in this cluster, probably. But the drive configuration has this one section, down on level 12 port side, where the energy pathways create a low-frequency resonance pattern that, over about 8 years, starts to degrade the alloy in the support struts 3 corridors over. Probably another 2 years before it's critical. Your engineering team hasn't found it yet because they're looking at efficiency metrics, not resonance patterns." Osrithvel was very still. "You found this in 3 days." 2, actually. I spent the 3rd day figuring out the fix." He set the object down. "It's not complicated. You need to introduce a counter-frequency emitter at 2 specific points along the pathway. Redirects the resonance energy into the ventilation system harmlessly. Takes about a day to install." "Why are you telling me this?" Howard looked at him. He had an interesting face, not remarkable in any individual feature, but composed in a way that gave the impression of someone who was almost always paying attention to something other than the obvious. "Because it's your ship," he said simply. "It'd be a shame for it to fail." "You realize," Osrithvel said carefully, "that you are on an enemy vessel. Or, at minimum, a vessel belonging to a civilization that has issued your homeworld a conquest requisition." Howard shrugged. "I know. But the ship didn't do that. The ship is just a ship. And it's a really good one." He picked up another object. "Besides, you and I both know that the requisition isn't going the way anyone planned." "And how?" Osrithvel said. "Do you know what I know?" "Carla told me," Howard said. Then, at Osrithvel's expression, "She tells us things. Every evening. She does a kind of debrief. Here's what I saw today. Here's what I think is true. Here's what I think is going to happen. She's usually right." He paused. "She said you removed the capacity for longing from your species. She said that's what this is all about. Not resources. Not power. Just a hole where something used to be." Osrithvel said nothing. Howard set down the object he'd been holding and looked out at the stars. "I've been broken like that," he said quietly. "Not the same thing. But the version where you can't want what you're missing because you can't name what's missing. So you just keep fixing things. Because fixing is the only time anything feels right." He paused. "It doesn't actually fill the hole, but it's honest about what the hole is shaped like." The stars moved outside. Not because the ship was moving, it was holding position. Because everything was always moving, always drifting, and the appearance of stillness was only ever local. "The resonance problem," Osrithvel finally said. "You said 2 years before critical. About that. Could be 18 months if the drive runs hot. What would you need to fix it?" Howard looked at the objects around him and smiled. Not widely, not triumphantly, just the small private smile of someone picking up a tool that fits their hand. "Already have most of it," he said. "I was hoping you'd ask." Nobody ever saw Simone Park do anything specific. This was, Carla had explained to Surithkelm during one of their increasingly long conversations, the point. Simone didn't intervene in things. She didn't rearrange them. She moved through spaces in which things were happening, and her presence, quiet, genuinely curious, radiating a kind of attentiveness that the Velthari found physiologically disorienting in ways they couldn't explain, changed the context in which things happened. Later, when the Dominion scholars tried to analyze what had occurred during the 11 days the humans were aboard the Dominion throne, the section on Simone Park was the shortest and the most confused. It documented a series of conversations that she had been proximate to, never a participant, always present, and noted that in each case, The Velthari participants reported that the conversation had ended differently than they had expected it to begin. An officer named Rethsal had been carrying a formal grievance against a superior for 11 years. Standard Dominion military hierarchy made such grievances nearly impossible to resolve. You absorbed them or you carried them until they curdled into something uglier. Rethsal had been carrying his for so long it had become a kind of identity. He ate near Simone on the 5th day. By the 6th morning, he had filed the grievance through a procedural channel that had technically existed for 40 years and had never been used. It was resolved in 72 hours. Rethsal was never able to explain what had shifted. She didn't say anything relevant, he told Surithkelm. We mostly talked about food. But I left the table with the feeling that I had been pretending something was impossible because the pretending was easier than trying. For other crew members reported variations of the same experience. The High Command liaison stationed aboard the throne, a severe, precise Velthari named Orvithnen who had been placed there specifically to report on Osrithvel's decision-making, had 2 meals near Simone Park. After the second one, Orvithnen filed a report to High Command that was notably different in tone from previous reports. Less focused on flagging deviance from protocol, more focused on actual conditions aboard the ship. More honest, in ways that made the report slightly less useful as surveillance and significantly more useful as information. Nobody had asked Orvithnen to change. Nobody had pressured or persuaded. Simone had simply been present, eating her food with apparent contentment, while Orvithnen's relationship with his own reporting quietly, privately, permanently shifted. Carla, when asked about this, said something that Surithkelm wrote down and could not stop thinking about afterward. Simone doesn't change people. She just makes it harder for them to pretend to themselves. Most change comes from that, not from persuasion, not from force. Just from the removal of the comfortable distance between what someone knows and what they're willing to acknowledge knowing. She paused. She's been doing it since she was 7. She has no idea she's doing it. Does she know what it is? Surithkelm asked. Carla considered this. She knows what people call it. They usually call it exhausting to be around. She's had that said to her most of her life. A beat. She thinks of it as a curse. I think of it as the most useful thing I've ever seen. On the 7th day, Vathorn did something he had never done in 60 years of Dominion service. He asked for help. It was not direct. He was not built for direct requests of this type. He approached it the way a Velthari general approaches any difficult terrain, by committing to movement and adjusting only when the obstacle was confirmed impassable. He had spent 3 days in private negotiation with Karlavas. These were not negotiation sessions in any form the Dominion recognized. There was no agenda. There were no positions stated and concessions offered. There were, instead, long conversations in which Vathorn found himself, repeatedly and with the unsettling regularity of a biological process he didn't control, saying true things. Not things he had decided to reveal as strategic concessions. Not things he had calculated it was useful to disclose. Just true things. Things that were accurate. On the 7th day, Carla had asked him a question that she said was unrelated to the requisition, to Earth, to the Dominion's strategic position. She asked it the way you might ask someone if they'd eaten, casually, with the assumption that the answer was ordinary. Do you have anything that you actually want? She asked. Not for the Dominion. Not as a military objective. Just you, personally. Something you want. Vathorn had sat with the question for a long time. He was 63 years old in Velthari terms. He had commanded armies. He had ended civilizations, not his word. The Dominion's word was resolved, with the clean efficiency of a system that had been built to expand and had never been given permission to question the expanding. He had been awarded the Dominion's highest military honor 7 times. He had held the requisition authority over 16 worlds. He had never, that he could remember, been asked what he personally wanted. The engineering of fear from the Velthari genome had been a triumph. The biological literature was clear on this. Fear had been replaced with clarity, with function, with the cold precision of a species that processed threat and responded to it without the paralytic interruption of emotional noise. What the literature was less clear about What, in fact, no Velthari researcher had published on in Vastrun's lifetime, because you could not publish what you could not name, was what happened to the things that had lived next to fear in the neural pathways. The longing, the Velsunneth, the ache toward what is absent. It hadn't been removed. It had been orphaned, cut off from its neighbor, deprived of context, running in the background of 63 years of command decisions as a persistent low signal that had no name and therefore no address. Kero, Vastrun said, using the word the way Carla had taught it, as a marker of intention, of stepping across a threshold, of mjhy. He looked at his hands. I want to know what it was for. The expansion. I have spent my life as its instrument. I have accepted that the instrument does not need to know the purpose. But I am old, and I find that He stopped. You want it to have meant something, Carla said. Not unkindly. Not justified. Just for something. Pointed somewhere real. Yes. That's not a small thing to want, she said. I know. I can't give you that. Nobody here can give you that. She met his eyes. But I can tell you that the question itself, the fact that you're asking it, is the most dangerous thing that's happened on this ship since we arrived. Not dangerous to us. Dangerous to the Dominion if it finds out that you're asking. And dangerous to the version of yourself that got comfortable not asking. Vastrun was quiet. The requisition, he said finally. If I recommend to High Command that it be withdrawn. They'll want a reason, Carla said. They'll want a strategic reason. Then let's build you one. She leaned forward. Because there are several. Real ones. Not invented. If you want them. The strategic case for withdrawing the Earth requisition, as developed by Carla Voss and Vastrun over 36 hours of conversation that Surith Kelm monitored and stopped understanding around hour 9, was not a diplomatic proposal. It was a threat assessment. This was important. Vastrun could not bring High Command a diplomatic proposal. He could not tell them that he had been convinced, or persuaded, or moved. He could not tell them what had actually happened in that room. High Command dealt in strategic realities, hard numbers, probability assessments, force calculus. So that was what they built. Carla's contribution was the framing, and it was elegant in the way that simple, accurate things are elegant. The Dominion's expansion model is optimized for civilizations with predictable response architectures. A predictable response architecture is one that responds to pressure with either submission or conventional resistance. Earth does not have a predictable response architecture. Evidence. Earth's response to the requisition was to send 11 civilians with no military authority and no governmental standing, carrying psychological profiles that no known threat classification system could adequately process. This is not a diplomatic strategy. This is a symptom of a civilization whose problem-solving methodology is fundamentally incompatible with the Dominion's engagement model. Projections. If the requisition proceeds to enforcement phase, Earth will not respond with either submission or conventional military resistance. Analysis of Earth's response patterns across 14 prior conflict scenarios involving other civilizations suggests Earth will respond with a combination of infrastructure adaptation, systemic disruption, and, most critically, the deployment of individuals precisely like the 11 currently aboard the Dominion throne into every available strategic space. Recommendation. The Earth engagement presents a net negative strategic outcome under all enforcement scenarios modeled. Withdrawal of the requisition under terms of mutual non-engagement represents the highest probability positive outcome for Dominion's strategic stability. Secondary recommendation. A new engagement framework for civilizations with non-standard response architectures should be developed. Earth can serve as a test case. Vastrun read the document 3 times. Then he made 7 modifications, not to the logic but to the language, sharpening it to the particular register that High Command responded to, removing anything that could read as uncertainty or persuasion. Then he looked at Carla. This is true, he said. Everything in this document is true. I don't write things that aren't, she said. There is one section, he said, pointing to the secondary recommendation, that is also something other than strategic analysis. I know, Carla said. He looked at her for a long moment. It is not possible, he said, for me to tell you what I would tell you, if I had the language for it. I know that too, she said. But Kero, I heard it anyway. It would be wrong to say that the other 9 members of the Earth delegation were less important. They were just less visible. 2 of them, a man named Torres and a woman named Yael, had been quietly mapping the Dominion throne's internal communication architecture for 7 days, not to intercept or disrupt, but to understand. When they were finished, Torres had written a 200-page analysis of how information actually moved through the Dominion's military command structure, as opposed to how the official hierarchy suggested it should move. The difference was significant. The analysis documented 11 structural bottlenecks where accurate information was routinely distorted before reaching command level, not through deception, but through the accumulated weight of institutional incentives that rewarded the presentation of certainty over the acknowledgement of complexity. Torres left the document on the table in the secondary meeting room on the 8th day with a note that said, "You probably already know most of this, but knowing something and having it written down clearly are different things. This is offered in the spirit of, we're not sure what word you'd use. Goodwill is ours. Take what's useful, ignore the rest." Keln read it in one sitting and then sat for a long time doing nothing. He recognized every bottleneck. He had personally contributed to several of them. A quiet, intense young man from Earth named Bashir had spent the entire 8 days in a methodical series of conversations with junior Velthari crew members, the lower ranks, the ones who maintained systems and cleaned corridors and ran routine diagnostics. He hadn't been debriefed about this. It wasn't in any plan. He had simply, apparently, found these conversations interesting. The junior crew had found the conversations unusual, then comfortable, then something that several of them described in their personal logs as the first time someone asked me what I actually thought and then listened to the answer. This was noted by Orvithnen, the High Command liaison, in his revised reporting style, as a potential cultural contamination vector. Keln, reading the report, crossed out the word contamination with a notation that said inaccurate and wrote above it in small precise script, "This is what perspective looks like from outside the model." The remaining 6 had done things that were harder to categorize: conversations, observations, small acts of comprehension that left impressions on the Dominion throne the way water leaves impressions on stone. Not immediately visible. Permanent. One of them, a woman named Grace who had barely spoken to any Velthari the entire time, had spent her days in the ship's small library, reading the Dominion's own historical records with the focused attention of someone who finds the past more revealing than anyone intended. On the 9th day, she wrote a single-page note and gave it to Osrithvel. He read it in his quarters alone. He read it 4 times. He did not share it with anyone, not even Keln. But the next time he sat down to write his command log, his characterization of the situation aboard the throne had changed in a way that his senior staff noticed immediately. He was writing about the Dominion the way an archaeologist writes about a site, with precision and care, and the underlying acknowledgement that the thing being studied was not permanent, that it was a moment in a longer story, that the story was still being written. For a Velthari commander, this was an extraordinary shift. No one asked Grace what had been in the note. She never mentioned it. On the 11th day, the shuttle was prepared. There was no ceremony. The Dominion did not do ceremonies for departures, only for arrivals, and only when the arrival represented a transfer of power. But there was, in the docking bay, an unusual number of crew members who had found reasons to be present. Maintenance tasks, inspection duties, reasons that were technically accurate and transparently not the real reason. They came to watch the 11 leave. Carla Voss walked out first, as she had walked in. She paused in the docking bay and looked around at the same power conduits, the same emitter positions, the same blast doors she had catalogued on arrival. Then she looked at the crew members who had gathered. She didn't say anything. She just looked, the way she always looked, systematically and completely, and she let herself be looked at in return, which was for her the less comfortable direction of the exchange. Dennis Hauer shook hands with 3 engineers who had spent 2 days working alongside him on the propulsion resonance fix. He had taught them the counterfrequency principle, not just the implementation. He had insisted on this. He said the fix only mattered if they understood it, because understanding meant they'd see the next version of the problem before it became critical, instead of after. The senior engineer, a Velthari named Parathsol who had spent 11 years aboard the throne and had never been given a technical insight by anyone outside the Dominion military, had shaken Hauer's hand with a formality that looked, to anyone paying attention, like it was covering something else. Simone Park walked through the docking bay quietly, not saying goodbye to anyone specifically.
She didn't need to.
Every room she walked through changed slightly in her wake, in ways that didn't show up in monitoring data and couldn't be recorded, and that the people in those rooms would keep finding in months and years ahead, like small discoveries in pockets they'd forgotten to check. Vaston was not in the docking bay. He was in the command chamber, composing his transmission to High Command. His recommendation. His strategic case. The document that was true and was also, beneath its cold precision, the closest thing to an act of Velsuneth that a Velthari general had managed in a generation. Osrith Vel stood at the docking bay entrance. When Carla reached him, she stopped. They regarded each other for a moment. The four-eyed commander of the most powerful warship in the cluster, and the 5'6" woman who had read his species with the attentiveness of someone who found it genuinely worth reading. Kero, Osrith Vel said. He had learned the word's proper use over 11 days. I want to ask you something. Ask. When Earth sent you, did they know what would happen? Did they predict this outcome? Carla was quiet for a beat. The coordination office predicted several possible outcomes, she said. This was one of them. Not the most likely one. Maybe the fourth or fifth. And the most likely? That you'd imprison us and proceed with enforcement, she said. Within 72 hours. Before we could do enough. A pause. But the people who sent us Kero, they weren't really calculating outcomes. They were asking a question. They looked at the Dominion and they said, there's something here that the requisition doesn't fit. Something that doesn't match the profile of what a pure expansionist empire looks like. And they sent us to find out what it was. And, did you find it? Carla looked at him for a long moment. Mjhy, she said quietly.
Yes.
We did. She walked to the shuttle. The door closed. The Dominion throne held position as the small, slightly crooked shuttle fired its salvaged Krellian thrusters and moved away through the dark. Osrith Vel stood at the observation window and watched it go. Surith Kelm came to stand beside him after a while. The High General's recommendation was transmitted to High Command, Surith Kelm said. 8 minutes ago. I know. If they accept it, they'll accept it, Osrith Vel said. Vastruan has not submitted a recommendation that was rejected in 40 years. And this one is correct. They'll recognize that it's correct. Surith Kelm was quiet. Then, the Torah's analysis. The communication bottlenecks. Some of them go back to founding Dominion doctrine. I know. Fixing them would require. I know, Surith Kelm. A long silence. Sir, Surith Kelm said at last, with the careful precision of someone saying something for the first time that had been true for a while. What do we do now? Osrith Vel watched the shuttle become a point of light, and then a point among points, indistinguishable from the stars, finding its way home through a universe that was still, for both of them, larger than anyone had yet managed to understand.
Kero, he said softly.
Mjhy. From here on, we figure that out.
Yendi.